SFBBO, promoting sustainability by engaging communities for more than 40 years. Our Birdy Hour speaker series is a free virtual program. On May 22, 2025, SFBBO biologist Sam Eberhard gave a Birdy Hour talk, Mixed Species Foraging Flocks and Functional Diversity in Costa Rica, for our community.
I'm Sam Eberhard. I'm a seasonal waterbird biologist with SFBBO. I'm coming to my end of 9 months here in the waterbird program. I've been monitoring the birds in these South Bay salt ponds and helping to continue that long data set that informs the restoration of those ponds and the possible returning of them back to tidal marsh. And before that, I've been working some seasonal jobs with birds, doing bird banding and other interesting things, photographing puffins. I really started out getting into this realm of studying birds, bird research, bird conservation at UC Santa Cruz. I graduated there with degrees in environmental studies and ecology and evolutionary biology. While I was at UC Santa Cruz, I was able to go down to Costa Rica on study abroad, and I was able to work it in a way where I was actually able to collect a fair amount of data down there on mixed species flocks. We'll get into what those are, but I was able to collect data and write it up for a senior thesis. And I'm currently still in the process of publishing that work. So that has been quite a great learning experience to publish that work in a scientific journal. And I'll be sharing a little bit about that tonight and really just diving into the background information that I've learned about things like the neotropics, which we will also be defining and getting into what that means with this talk. So I think I'll share my screen and we'll get into it. All right, so mixed species foraging flocks in Costa Rica is what I'll be talking about. They're a very interesting, dynamic, chaotic way of looking at the functioning of bird communities down in the tropics. And that's what I've spent a while thinking about recently, and I'm excited to get into it. All right, let's see. Okay. So this Birdy Hour, I'm going to try to explain my research at a level that is accessible to everyone. I'm going to go over some background, some definitions, and hopefully by the end of this, we'll be able to really unpack what the title of my research means. So that title being Functional Diversity of Avian Mixed Species Foraging Flocks on the Tiburon Cordillera in Costa Rica. And then I think it's important to use these concepts and this research and apply it for conservation, because at the end of the day, that's what we're about here. What we're about at SFBBO is conserving bird populations and working towards a more stable future. And so that's what I hope to accomplish. All right, so let's get into the questions that I'll be addressing. So what are the neotropics and what about the tropics drives biodiversity? What are mixed species flocks and why do they form? Why study these flocks on a gradient? So as you might have gotten from the title of my research, this is looking at an elevational gradient. And so why is it interesting to look at an elevational gradient? What can we learn from that? What can functional diversity tell us about bird communities? So functional diversity is an aspect of diversity and biodiversity in a way we measure biodiversity that I hope to explain and get into a little bit. And I think by the end of this presentation, I might also have a good answer for how many ovenbirds there are. So stay tuned for that. All right, avian diversity in the neotropics. So the neotropics are the realm of tropical regions in the New World. So They extend from Mexico down into Amazonia, Brazil, and it can be a little bit confusing, the word neotropics, because sometimes it refers to the neotropical realm, which is actually a biogeographical region, which refers to the kind of connectedness of species throughout evolutionary history as it relates to the way continents have spread apart. So that extends all the way down to this tip of South America. But when I refer to the neotropics, I'm referring to just the tropical latitudes in the New World. So this region is the land of hummingbirds and not sunbirds. So in the tropics of Asia and Africa, you have sunbirds. In the neotropics, you have hummingbirds. So some of you may not know that, or some of you may know, but hummingbirds are actually exclusive only to the New World. Birds in the Old World, they can't do what hummingbirds do. They can't hover quite as effectively and get nectar. They actually have to perch on the flowers and extract nectar that way. So what makes the tropics such a kind of paradise for birds? Part of it is how warm and relatively even the photo period is. So what I mean by that is because of the way the Earth is tilted on its axis, we have seasons, right? And at the equator, seasonality isn't as strong because the sun is not going to have an increased or decreased photo period with winter and summer. So there will be more or less constant day length, and that provides enough light for all the productivity to happen, for vegetation to grow constantly, and just have a really verdant, great landscape that's very amenable to birds. So to really get a feel for that, I thought it might be helpful to share that Costa Rica has approximately 200 more species of birds than California, even though it's 1/8 the size. So that starts to give you a kind of indication of why it can be so interesting to go down to the neotropics and see the diversity of really anything. It's not just birds, of course. Diversity is driven by the base of the food web and then all the way up. So the diversity of birds is direct result of the diversity of other organisms, the things they eat, the things they nest in, everything like that. All right, and so I've included a hummingbird, of course. In the top right, we have a sunbird, and then we have a map of bird species richness. So species richness is a term that refers simply to how many birds species are in a given area. And so as you can see, the area near Brazil, or Amazonia as it's called, has very high bird diversity. And especially as you get into the Andes Mountains along the western coast of South America, you get very high levels of diversity. And we'll start to talk about why mountains are so important for diversity. But yeah, we'll get into that. As you can see, in Africa, in the tropical regions, there's also very high levels of bird species richness. Those red spots also correspond to mountains. And similarly in Southeast Asia, you start to get some high mountains over there near the Indian subcontinent, and there's very high diversity there as well. Right. All right, so I figured it would also make sense to go over why biodiversity matters. I think a lot of us here all agree that biodiversity is a good thing, and that keeping healthy populations of as many species as possible is not only beneficial to humans, but just a good thing, right? It's never great to tamper with nature and decrease the amount of wildlife there is, right? But in justifying this to anyone who might not find agreement with that statement, ecosystems or biodiversity is very important for having healthy ecosystems, because healthy ecosystems provide ecosystem services, which are clean, can create clean water and air, provide our raw materials for everything to do with our economies. They provide places for recreation, stuff like that, right? And so ecosystems can be seen as a web of intertwined interactions. That's what ecology hopes to unpack and investigate, right? And so one thing that has been found by ecologists is that when certain species and certain parts of these interesting interconnected webs are taken apart, you can have cascading consequences. So a classic example is sea urchins on the California coast, right? Sea urchins are big grazers. They eat up all the little plant material on the bottom of the ocean. But if their sea urchin numbers are not kept in check by sea otters, you start to have what's called a trophic cascade, and cascading consequences when you lose an important single species like a sea otter. So those are just some of the reasons why you can justify keeping high levels of biodiversity for our own selfish human interests. But as I mentioned, I think it's just enough to say that we might as well keep as many species around simply because it's great to not meddle with things that we don't fully understand. I've provided a picture of a somewhat rare species of plant with interesting red berries that, for example, one might posit that a bird disperses these berries, and maybe these berries are important for a certain species of bird and keeping them alive. It's really hard to say, and without kind of proper investigation, it's hard to say exactly what role this plant plays in the environment, but chances are it's pretty important in some way. That's also a picture of a band-tailed pigeon down in Costa Rica that I took. And some of you may know about the passenger pigeon, which is an extinct species of pigeon that used to be the most abundant bird in North America. And many studies have kind of investigated what has happened since the passenger pigeon has been lost. And it's definitely known that consequences have followed the loss of that species. And I'm definitely team keeping the pigeons around. All right, so as I promised, we're going to get into mountains in the neotropics. So what mountains do is they create something called abiotic gradients. Abiotic gradients are gradients in which factors that influence life that are not living, so temperature, rainfall, things like that, they change on a spatial scale. So mountains create these abiotic gradients like diversity in geology, temperature diversity. So as you go up a slope and you gain elevation, you start to get a drop off in temperature. And then also mountains, importantly, influence regional climate and microclimate diversity. So in the tropics, it's often kind of assumed that there's good weather year round, but oftentimes that's not the case. Prevailing weather patterns from the ocean and ocean currents oftentimes shift throughout the year and can create distinct seasonal regimes with like wet seasons and dry seasons. And oftentimes mountains play a role in creating barriers and also creating different patterns of rainfall. So as warm clouds holding lots of water rise up mountains, they cool off, and cool air can't hold as much water. So more rain will fall over mountains than over lowlands. And so that's just one way that mountains can kind of increase the diversity of abiotic factors and therefore create different environments for high levels of species turnover, right? So as species need to find different niches where they have different sets of these abiotic factors that can drive diversity as you go up the slope. All right. In 1967, a scientist from maybe not California, Jansen, proposed that mountain passes are higher in the tropics. And, he didn't mean this literally, of course. Some of the highest mountain passes are not in the tropics. But what he meant was that because of temperature stability in the tropics, species are actually able to have much smaller tolerance ranges to where they can reside. So as one goes up the elevational gradient, species will turn over much quicker because they're able to specialize in a single smaller band of elevation because of the tropics' ability to not have much seasonal variation, not much year-to-year variation as well. Mountains can be seen as both barriers and refugia. So in terms of evolutionary history, mountains can, for example, stop ice ages, right? They can stop the path of glaciers or, in turn, shelter species that would be refugia. So going into basically the way species are spread across the tropics, you can look at evolutionary history and biogeography to determine distinct regions of species with different history. And mountains are often that barrier and that point at which two regions of distinct biogeography collide. And so that can be yet another factor in increasing the biodiversity of the area. Right. All right. So a lot of what we'll be doing is talking about the patterns of diversity along elevational gradients. And that's why I was investigating. So avian species diversity, as a general rule, usually declines at the highest elevations and latitudes. That's because as you go up in elevation, you have less oxygen, but also less warmth, right? Birds are warm-blooded creatures. They need oxygen, and they also need a degree of warmth generally to be the most efficient, to get the most energy. And that is the case with plants and a whole bunch of other organisms that birds rely on. So in the tropics, the middle elevations are often where diversity peaks. This is often associated with areas of higher rainfall. As I was talking about earlier, as clouds go up a mountain, they'll start to drop their water. And often the middle elevations is where they're dropping the most water, which leads to the most amount of vegetation growth. So as you can see on the picture on the right, these tropical forests oftentimes have just incredible amounts of vegetation, right? They've got understory growth, there's epiphytic growth, so growth of plants on trees, there's moss, there's lichens, and there's just so many different options for where birds can forage. Little nooks and crevices where insects will hide and where birds can probe their beaks in and attempt to get food. All right. And as I was alluding to earlier, I already kind of addressed that point that mountains are the borders of distinct biogeographical regions usually. And so we'll get into what's so special about the area I was in Costa Rica and how actually different slopes of different mountains can have very different sets of species. All right, mixed species foraging flocks. So these are associations of birds that form because birds that join an already existing group of birds, or even just a single bird, may get benefits from joining that group. And it's not necessarily a solved case on why birds do this. It may differ on a species to species basis. It may differ on a location basis, but these flocks are very common phenomena. They happen all over the globe in pretty much every terrestrial ecosystem, but they're especially common in the tropics. So those who have been to the tropics may be familiar with birding in the tropics. It often involves walking around for a while, finding a flock, and then just enjoying all the diversity in said flock. But there are hypotheses of why these flocks form. So there are possible benefits that include reduced predation risk. So this comes in the form of not just only a selfish idea of if you're part of a herd, you're less likely to be the one that gets eaten by the predator. That can be as simple as the reducing predation risk, but it can also come in the form of alarm calls and having more eyes to look for predators. So if you're a part of a flock and you're a selfish bird, maybe you can forage more and look for predators less. And that leads into the second point. That may just equate to foraging efficiency, right? And furthermore, if you're foraging in a pack, it may be possible that the pack itself starts to expose food, right? It flushes insects. Maybe there's some juicy insect that's hiding in the bark that's disturbed by another bird, but not eaten by that bird. And the kind of selfish bird that's joined the pack is able to track that insect down. All right. The way these flocks form is oftentimes because of a gregarious nuclear species. So on the right here, I have two different birds called Chloraspingus, and they're actually in the tanager family. They look a little bit like sparrows, but they're tanagers found in the tropics. And the one on the top is called the common Chloraspingus, and it's an extremely common flocking bird that oftentimes has other birds associated with it. The one on the bottom is a sooty-capped Chloraspingus, I believe, and that is found at higher elevations and is not quite as common as the common Chloraspingus. Very effective name there. All right. And yeah, as I mentioned, these flocks are extremely common throughout tropical ecosystems and thus kind of a great thing to study because they're somewhat easy to find everywhere you go. Right. Here's a few different examples of birds that can be seen in flocks in Costa Rica. So on the top left, we have an emerald tanager. So a huge variety of tanagers can join these flocks. They're oftentimes extremely bright colors and just really beautiful birds. Bottom left, there's the common Chloraspingus again, very common member, likely kind of the most prevalent member in flocks in the area I was in Costa Rica. Then in the middle, we've got a northern barred wood creeper. So these wood creepers are birds that hitch along trunks, kind of like a nuthatch or a wood creeper that, like a brown creeper that we have in North America. But in the tropics, there's a huge diversity of these birds, and we'll actually get into them a little bit more further in the presentation. And then in the top right, we have a yellow-throated vireo. Vireos are also super common in flocks. They enjoy being able to join and just hunt for little grubs. They don't forage necessarily as quickly as some of these other species, but they are extremely common to see in a flock. And then, of course, you've got your warblers. Down on the bottom right, we've got a collared redstart, a cool little neotropical species that was quite common at the higher elevations in my research. All right, so let's get into why might we study mixed species flocks? As I mentioned before, they're quite prevalent and easy to find, and so that means that there's a lot of background and research that's done previous that can be helpful in comparing and informing research that goes into these flocks. They're also a convenient ecological system. So in ecology, you're always looking to study species interactions between species, how they help each other, how they compete with each other, stuff like that. And of course, it makes sense that mixed species flocks would be a nice unit for studying that. Plus, they're just really cool. And in my own opinion, they have some of the good birds. We'll get into some of those species, but it's just so enjoyable to walk around the forest, hear, commotion, some chaos, and start looking through a mixed species flock. On the right, top right, we have a spangled cheeks tanager. That's a species I was not able to photograph well because they really enjoy hanging upside down and moving through all sorts of leaves in the upper elevations of the mountains in Costa Rica. But just an incredibly beautiful bird. And then bottom right, chestnut-capped warbler, another somewhat common bird to find in flocks, especially at the lower elevations of the Pacific slope, but we'll get into that. All right, so where did I do my research? I was in the town of Monteverde, which is both a town and a small region of Costa Rica. It's a fairly popular tourist location, so many of you listening may be familiar with this spot, and I definitely recommend going there. It's an amazing place. It's one of those places where it's known for having resplendent quetzals, and that's certainly a bird that many people want to see. And so I've included my somewhat low quality picture of the one time I saw a resplendent quetzal, and it was certainly an experience. But yeah, a lot of other great experiences there too, of course. On the right, you've got a margay that was, yeah, top right is a margay. It's a small cat that is quite rare to see. So I was very excited to see that there in Monteverde. And then a common sight around town is this blue-gray tanager in the bottom right, another beautiful tanager. Sometimes will join mixed species flocks, but is a very common bird in the gardens and around town. All right, so now I'm going to get into the methodology of the research I conducted when I was down there on my study abroad, and how I actually went about studying these mixed species flocks there. All right, so I was looking at an elevational gradient of 624 meters. It's about 2,000 feet. And the interesting thing about it is it spanned the continental divide. So in these mountains near Monteverde, the Tiburon Cordillera, the continental divide runs right through the highest spine of the mountains there. And I was able to kind of look at the differences that elevation creates on either side of that divide. And so I would opportunistically walk these quiet forest trails and dirt roads looking for flocks. And when I encountered a flock, I would note down the species composition and a couple other things to really understand what was going on with each individual flock. I divided this gradient into 3 different zones. So we had the Pacific zone, which was the lower elevations of the Pacific side of the continental divide, had the upper elevations, which was the kind of top half, and then the Atlantic side or zone, which had the lower elevations of the Atlantic side. Then I was looking at different metrics of diversity of these flocks. So I was looking at species richness, which we already went over, which is simply a count of how many species I saw in the flocks of each zone. I looked at functional richness, evenness, and divergence, which are interesting metrics I'll get into a little bit, which have to do with not just what species are there, but actually how a species interacts with its environment, how its traits can inform what the species' role in the environment is. And then I also looked at foraging gill diversity. So looking at what types of food these birds were eating, whether they're insectivorous, nectivorous, frugivorous, and kind of just getting an understanding of how they interact with the environment in terms of what they eat. All right, so here's a big old table of results. And I will caution that this study is not the most overreaching study in terms of how many flocks were observed. There were 16 flocks observed in each zone. So I wasn't able to necessarily solidify all these differences statistically, but it's an interesting jumping off point for looking into patterns of diversity in these mixed species flocks over the gradient. So interestingly enough, the upper elevations did seem to have a fair few less species in terms of species richness. So the Atlantic zone had 37, the upper elevations had 23, and the Pacific was back up with 33. So there seemed to be a little bit of a trend there that perhaps upper elevations flocks had less species in general, or the species pool was smaller. And then there's these metrics of functional richness, functional evenness, functional divergence. I won't get too much into them, but we'll talk about what functional diversity is on the next slide. Similarly, stuff like mean number of species did not differ too much. Mean number of individuals, not really a huge trend there. And then, yeah, there was not a huge difference in flocks in terms of other metrics, other than kind of the breakdown of the trophic guilds, the foraging breakdown. So you can see that there's definitely a lot of invertivore species. So birds that eat invertebrates, spiders, flies, bugs, whatever that may be. And then the next most common foraging guild was frugivores. So birds that primarily eat berries, fruit, but even so, there was a huge drop off. You can see in the Atlantic zone, we had 30 invertivore species, but only 5 frugivores, 1 omnivore, 1 nectarivore, a bird that specifically specializes in nectar. And then I also did a little bit of a look at how many migrant species, neotropical migrants, which are birds that breed primarily in North America and then fly down to the tropics to spend their winter. Because I was conducting this research in the winter, there was a fair amount of neotropical migrants present. Right. So I promised I'd get into functional diversity and what that means. So basically, functional diversity uses what are called functional traits to enhance our understanding of biodiversity. So functional traits are really just any trait about a bird that helps to describe how it interacts with its environment. Things like tail length, wing length, bill width, bill length, things like that that describe, how a bird eats, how a bird flies, how a bird even perches. And since this helps give insights into how a bird interacts with its environments, it also gives insights into a species' ecological niche. So how it's carved out its area and how it forages and how it utilizes resources in relation to the other species around it. So there's been some studies that have investigated what functional diversity has in terms of implications for conservation. And high functional diversity has been shown to be very closely related with ecosystem resilience. So that kind of gives the reasoning for why it's so interesting to look at functional diversity, because ecosystems with high numbers of functional diversity have better results in terms of withstanding environmental degradation and just overall being healthier. On the right, I have some photos of 2 birds that utilize the kind of niche of mountain streams in the tropics. There's a American dipper, and then there's also a little bird called a torrent tyrannulet up on the top. And these birds are, kind of found in the same place, but they might have similar colors, but they have different traits that can kind of give insights into what they might be doing in that specific environment that's different, and why, if you lose one from the environment, that might have consequences because they're not necessarily doing the same thing. All right. Okay, so functional traits I mentioned, and this is a very important part of calculating those metrics of functional diversity that I mentioned on that results table. So I asked the question, what makes a hairy woodpecker not a downy? And of course, this is somewhat of a reoccurring question if you're a beginner birder in Northern California, but you can also look at it from the perspective of functional traits. Things like how long the beak is at the culmen. That's a measurement that is quite different between hairy and downy woodpeckers. They definitely have a different mass. Hairy woodpeckers are much heavier than downy woodpeckers. And so having these functional traits can start to just tell you about a bird without even having to look at it. And something that's been extremely helpful in recent years for this research is the AVONet database, which is an open source data set that includes data and measurements on pretty much every species of bird in the world. And it's what I use to get data on all the functional traits of the species I looked at in Costa Rica. All right, and then I also wanted to shout out investment in natural history collections and bird banding, because how researchers have extracted these traits is by measuring study skins in museums or measuring live birds through the process of bird banding to get things like these wing measurements and bill measurements and everything that's needed. On the top right, we have just a diagram from a study that shows something called hand wing index, which is a measure of the shape of a bird's wing, and it helps quantify how good a bird is at flying. And this dispersal ability quantification is incredibly useful regarding how susceptible a bird is to habitat fragmentation. So if you're thinking about how forests are getting cut up in Brazil, you might be able to be informed about which birds are most affected based off this hand wing index. And then in the bottom right, we have a table that I used for calculating these functional diversity metrics for my research. We've got the species on the left, and then we've got all the average is on lengths of the bill, beak width, mass, and then hand wing index, which I also included for understanding the morphological diversity of birds, the way they're shaped and the way they fly. All right, so I kind of skipped over explaining functional diversity indices because it's more interesting to look at it in this diagram, which initially is perhaps a bit confusing, but I'll do my best to explain. So what this is this a principal component analysis, which basically plots all the species that I looked at on two axes. And these axes correspond to those functional traits. And as you can see, there's 4 arrows. I looked at 4 morphological functional traits for this. And the way these species are spread out over the plane gives insights into how unique each species is. So I've labeled the dots that correspond to species that are particularly notable in terms of diverging from the main clump of species. And those are the species that are oftentimes bigger. So they're going out towards higher mass, they're going towards longer bills and thicker bills, or maybe they have an extremely low hand wing index. Like at the bottom, we have the species Rhythoterna holiarthra. I can't pronounce it, but that's called the Rufous mourner. It's a kind of interesting little ruddy flycatcher down there, and that's a species with an extremely small handwing index, which means that it's probably not very good at flying long distances and dispersing. So this principal component analysis looks at the species in the Atlantic slope or the Atlantic zone. I've got one for the upper elevations. It shows species of trogon that has a very low handwing index, but high levels of mass and bill width. And then there's the Pacific zone with another trogon, the same trogon species, Trogon coloraris, the colored trogon. And then we've got some species out here. One of the most unique species is that Dendrocolaptes species, which is a species of wood creeper. And I find wood creepers very interesting, so we'll get into that. So as I was getting to, these are morphological outlier species. They're species that are very different from the main members of flocks, which are often small little birds, warblers and vireos, that flit around really fast, grab little insects, and a lot of them are very similar to each other. They might have very different colors, but functionally and in terms of the shape of their bills and the way they forage, they're very similar, and they all kind of fall into those clumps that we were looking at on the previous slides. But species like the collared trogon shown here are very different, and I was honestly quite surprised to see them in flocks. I didn't think of them as a species that would benefit from joining mixed species flocks, but sure enough, they would follow along and keep pace with mixed species flocks, and certainly seem to be utilizing the benefits of joining that group. Collared trogons I saw in both the upper elevations and the Pacific zones. I didn't find one in the Atlantic zone, but it's entirely possible that if I were to continue this research, I would start to see them there too. So they're a large-bodied frugivore, which has previously been shown to be particularly vulnerable to habitat degradation. So very cool species to see in flocks for sure. All right, another morphological outlier species is this brown-billed scythebill. So as you can see in the image, they're a very interesting bird with a long decurved bill that they use for accessing deep little crevices, prying spiders out of there, and foraging in a very unique way. And so I took this picture in the upper elevation zone, and it was just really fun for me to see this super unique bird following along with a flock, flying from tree branch and tree trunk to tree trunk, right at very low levels in the forest canopy. And it's yet another one of those birds with a very low hand wing index, which means for flying long distances and flying at speed, it's not a very great wing setup. But it certainly has a great bill for certain foraging situations, very different from a lot of the other species in these flocks. It's also a species that's known to be very scarce and low density and require large tracts of undegraded forest, unfragmented forest. And so there kind of seems to be this correlation between birds that are most unique and having the most stringent requirements for habitat. All right, so that wood creeper that we were just talking about, the brown-billed scythebill, is part of the family Funariidae, which includes all these birds pictured to the right. And they are known as ovenbirds and wood creepers, this family. It includes more than 200 species. And as I said at the start of this talk, I would give a crack at telling you how many different ovenbirds there are. And through my investigation, I found that of the 200 plus species of Funariidae, it seems like maybe 8 of them build ovens, and that's why they're called oven birds. They build these nests that are like these clay oven-like formations with a little door, and they go inside and raise their young in there. And so that's why they're called oven birds, just like the oven bird from North America, which is a warbler and unrelated to these birds. All right, and so these birds often hitch up trunks, as I was saying, and are quite unique. They will sometimes cling upside down to moss and probe into cavities, and there's a whole diversity of them. But one thing I noted is that it was extremely uncommon to see them outside of a flock. They were pretty much always associated with other birds and seem somewhat dependent on flocks for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they help with foraging, but I think that it is likely due to the ability of the other birds to see predators better. I think that if you're a bird on the side of a tree, oftentimes in kind of the lower levels of the forest, you don't have very good view of predators like little forest hawks that might come in and grab you. So that's my hypothesis for why these birds might be so dependent on mixed species flocks. All right. And so oftentimes ecological and conservation research ties into climate change because climate change is an issue that affects almost everything with regards to biology, conservation, and ecology. So I definitely think that it's extremely relevant to talk about with neotropical mountains because it's been shown that already birds are shifting their ranges oftentimes upslope to keep pace with changes in their environment. And projections of climate change have shown that this is likely going to be the case in the future. And when I was down in Costa Rica, I talked with locals who, unprompted, would tell me about species range shifts and how previously they hadn't ever seen a certain species, at their farm, but now it was all the way up at the ridges, and it definitely seems to be a very relevant issue to the area and has implications for the future that I think warrants more study. And this is kind of my argument for why it's incredibly interesting to look at mixed species flocks in the face of this threat, because these are complicated systems with complex interactions, and it's really hard to say how, as species shift around, these reactions or these associations will continue, and what the implications for that could be. All right, that brings me to the end of my slides, but I realized I was talking a little bit fast and may have skipped over some things or forgotten some things, so I welcome any questions, and I'll hand it back to Kristen for that.
Sam, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I don't think you talked too fast. I think it was just perfect. Well, look, we got a question already. Laura asks, what are your next steps in investigating these elevational gradients further? California, neotropics?
Interesting question. These elevational gradients, with regards to birds, are definitely most pronounced in the neotropics, as I was mentioning, with small elevational ranges for these species and just huge species turnover as you move up with elevation. It's certainly very interesting to study these interactions in the neotropics. I'd really be interested in going to Peru at some point. In the Andes, you have elevational gradients that range upwards of 3,000 meters. For reference, my study was on a gradient of 624 meters, so it's definitely a big step up in terms of the amount of variation you can see. And but that said, elevational gradients exist up into the temperate zones as well, and so it could be certainly interesting to look at the Sierras or mountains in California for that type of situation. Yeah.
Go on. Thank you. And thanks for the question. Well, I had a question, which is you talked earlier, I think you sort of answered it just now, but you talked earlier about this being a good springboard study for future studies. So my sort of a two-part question of what future studies would you envision people would take this study and take it further? And then the other is, I know that you're going to be publishing this work. Maybe talk a little bit about the power of publishing this work and the connections that you can make to other scientists through that, and also We talk about science a lot, and we also know that science is really powerful when it is used. And what kinds of impacts would you want to come eventually from this kind of research?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. This study was definitely not a all-encompassing large scope study. It involved data collection that spanned only about 2 weeks towards the end of my study abroad in Costa Rica. And so, yeah, there's not a whole lot that can be statistically relevantly implied from my results, but it's definitely a bit of a unique study in how it incorporates both sides of the continental divide. And I think that there are many mountain ranges in the neotropics down into the Andes that could benefit from looking at how each side of the elevational gradient is different and kind of looking into those microclimates. Um, and yeah, in terms of publishing scientific research, um, studies can definitely inform conservation. Sometimes studies don't necessarily make the requisite connections that are helpful, but I'm also currently a co-author on another paper that's looking into informing where there are gaps in Colombia's current protected areas and how functional diversity can be better protected in Colombia. So yeah, there's definitely promise there.
Excellent. And of course, doing this talk tonight is part of that outreach and sharing the information with others and allowing it to be part of the conversation. Another question that I thought of as we were going through your presentation is, were there any connections that you drew the last 9 months here at SFBBO and the work that you did with us and the work that you did there? Any similarities around the questions that you asked or the impacts that you were seeing?
For sure, yeah. Part of my job is identifying every species that is utilizing these ponds in the South Bay. But a lot of the data analysis comes down to guild level analysis. So it's not necessarily about each individual species, but more separating the species into these functional guilds of, what they're eating and what size they are and stuff like that. So that's definitely a commonality there. And of course, climate change is always something that applies to pretty much all conservation research. And so I feel like migration timing and bird numbers are definitely going to be affected by climate change and already are probably.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I had one more question, which I usually ask our speakers, which is our mission is to involve communities and, people have, I'm sure, been inspired by your presentation. Are there any suggestions you have for people getting involved in conservation of these species, either at the local level or in the neotropics, things that people can carry forward?
Sure. I think one thing that all people can do is participate in citizen science. Citizen science is something that doesn't require any degree and really any expertise, at least to start out with. And so going out and helping contribute photos to platforms like eBird and iNaturalist can really help us better understand distribution of species and yeah, like it doesn't have to only be birds. You can go anywhere, even just out in your backyard and observe some species. And sometimes they can have very interesting finds. I've helped to document new populations of plants in the Sierras and um, even possibly discover a new species of plant in California. So um, I would recommend that as a way for participating in science, but also just kind of cultivating a love and understanding of nature, I think can lead to many cool pathways to helping out.
Excellent. Good answer. Thank you. And it looks like we're here at the end of the hour, perfectly timed. Sam, your presentation was great. Thank you, everybody, for coming. You've got several thank yous in the comments as well. And I think people really enjoyed your presentation. SFBBO is a nonprofit. With your support, we will continue to inform decision makers, inspire people to act, and involve diverse communities in our work. Please visit our website to learn more and get involved today.